Welcome to Influential Minds, an EEI International Conversation series, which aims to discuss ideas that move the needle towards a more sustainable future with thought leaders from across the globe. Here's your host, Senior Vice President of International Programs at EEI, Dr. Lawrence Jones.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome. Thanks for joining us here, Dr. Ann-Christine Duhaime from Massachusetts.
Thank you for having me. This is going to be an interesting conversation.
Let me first of all congratulate you on the book, Minding the Climate, How Neuroscience Can Help Solve Our Environmental Crisis. Let's begin, Christine, by you, perhaps, Ann-Christine, just telling us what got you involved in neuroscience or in the brain to begin with? Why the brain of all things in the world?
Of all things in the world, the brain is it. So the brain, to me, is the reason that we are who we are, and is the answer to all questions, or virtually all questions, about why we behave the way we behave. Mm-hmm. And from very early in my life, this was an overriding curiosity. If one has this sort of curiosity, you may go in many directions. You may become a philosopher. You may become someone in religion. You may become someone in science. And I ended up on the science and neuroscience pathway just because the brain was just so very interesting and an endless source of awe and fascination.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the book. This is one of the few books I've seen that sort of links climate to the brain. Talk about that. What drove you to make that connection between the climate and the brain?
If you are in the neurosciences, and as you know, I'm a neurosurgeon, you think about everything in terms of the brain, just like a chef thinks about everything in terms of ingredients and recipes, and someone who's in construction thinks about how things are built. If you are immersed in that world, you see the world through the lens of that area. And to me, the climate crisis, which I see as our biggest existential threat, can be viewed through the lens of the brain and neuroscience, simply because we humans are the cause of the problem, and we humans will be the solution to the problem should we be smart enough to figure one out or figure multiple simultaneous solutions out. So looking at that connection between how the brain is designed to operate, why it's designed that way, through the tutelage of evolutionary pressures, and how that design has influenced both the cause and the potential solutions, seems a very logical connection to me.
Mm-hmm. As I was reading the book, I was intrigued by the examples you gave regarding just understanding the complexity of the brain. Being an engineer myself, I love the examples about the circuitry of the brain. So for the audience, just tell us, how does the brain actually work?
Well, I can tell you that in 30 seconds, you'll get it. But in the book, I had to do my own exploration to try to answer these questions. Now, obviously, as a neurosurgeon, I have to know something about how the brain works, because otherwise I couldn't do my job. But I think a different way to answer your question is, why does it work the way it works? And if you ask the why question, you'll get to the how question. The brain started, like all of biology, with simpler organisms that then became more and more complicated over time. And I had to go back to single cells, because I know you have children. I had children that grew up in the era of Harry Potter. And it was as though you could have a magic wand that would simply make magic occur. And that's how things happened. But when you think about biology and you think about the brain, it had to start somewhere and get more complicated. How did it start in terms of something like decision-making at the simplest level? And I had to go all the way back to single cells, to bacteria, to say, how does a cell know to move towards a source of nutrition like sugar and away from a source of a toxin like ammonia? How does it do that? Well, at the single cell level, it does it with the same principle that scales all the way up to the brain. In that, the way it works is this: there is some molecule on the surface of that single cell, that bacteria. And that molecule, just by chance, by random things that occur, eventually a molecule ended up on the cell surface that when it interacts with some other molecule out there in the world, the molecule on the cell surface changes shape so that certain kinds of substances, typically charged substances, can get into the cell or can get out of the cell, and it changes what's on the inside of the cell. And over time, a cell that happened to have molecules that could move away from the toxin or towards the sugar had a survival advantage. And it's an example of how things work by biochemical interactions that create what we call behavior. It does this instead of that. It does this under these circumstances and that under those circumstances. Now, our brains, evolving over, as you know, millions of years, have those same principles inside cells, inside organs, such that chemical reactions occur that make things happen, and they end up as behavior. So it's under evolutionary pressures that that time designed the brains we have today. And how they work is based on those basic principles. In the book, we talk about the reward system.
Mm-hmm.
People tend to think that reward means a pat on the head or an extra prize or extra money. That's my reward. That's how we use the word reward in common conversation. But in the brain, the reward system is the system of interactions in the brain, largely run on the power of electrochemical connections and processes that helped us learn what we needed to learn to survive as a species. Mm-hmm. And so the scaffolding from single cells where you do this or that, depending on external chemicals, to internal cognitive processes and decision-making that happens with millions of simultaneous or closely linked events for every decision, happen based on the same principles of what will help us survive. So like that single cell moving towards the nutrition and away from the toxin helped it survive. In our brains, decisions that helped us survive that were mediated by neurotransmitters aligned with the evolution of the reward system is how we make our decisions today. It's all based on the same principles that have gotten more complicated, but the same basic principles underlie all of these functions.
We'll get into the reward system, but just to sort of a surmise. So basically we have 86 billion neurons in the brain, lots of complex systems, and it's not one single thing that affects the decisions that we make. I was intrigued when I was reading the book when you talk about the fact that sometimes decisions are being made, you're not even aware of what's happening in the background. Talk about that where, people sitting here, even as they sit here, this conversation is having an impact on the decision they might make tomorrow. Talk about what I would call the latency of decision-making where you may not even be aware that you're making a decision made on something you saw, heard, felt, touched, smelled decades ago, a year ago. How does that work?
Because each thing that happens to you, internal, external, the internal influences of, are you hungry? Did you get a good night's sleep last night? The external influences of what happened that is in your memory but might not be in your conscious awareness, all the things that have happened to you, each change your brain. Mm. And so things that happened to you in childhood, things that happened last week, a movie you saw 3 months ago, each of these things in some way has changed the connections, the strength of the connections, the predispositions in your brain. So you are carrying around a lifetime in your own lifetime, as well as genetic influences and epigenetic influences going back, forever, that influence the decisions that you make at any one time. Now we all think, because we, can consciously reflect on this, that these decisions are logical. I know why I did that. But in fact, things are influencing you all the time that are below your level of conscious awareness. You are who you are because of all the things that have happened to you. some of which had a bigger impact than others because they were influential for a variety of reasons that made them stronger than other things. And the genetic influences, which you can sometimes recognize, you say, I was just like my dad when I said that. And things that come down through the centuries that you're not aware of. And so our decision making is a complex, multi-million event process at any one time. We don't know that, but the book goes into understanding that at sort of a more visceral level.
Yeah, I enjoyed the chapter on reward system, right? Because there are rewards that affect what we do. And you talk about some of the different reward schemes, like money is a reward for some people. Let's tie it back to climate change, right? In the book, you talk a lot about the difficulty to change our behavior, and it's part of the reward system. Link climate change, this difficulty in making decisions to change our behavior, back to understanding the brain. What's the linkage there?
So climate change in particular plays to our weaknesses. And this is because if you think about what we needed to survive during evolutionary time, when our brains were being designed, most of our decisions for survival were short-term, immediate decisions. Climate change is difficult because it is more long-term. We've never faced a problem like this. We don't have collective societal, cultural understanding of these problems. They've not occurred before. So we don't have cultural history to call upon. And we were designed on a chassis, so to speak, of decision-making that by and large, while we have the ability to think ahead to some extent, more of our survival decisions were short-term and immediate. And we had also the additional reward, besides resources and security and things that now are represented by monetary or financial gain, we had acquisitiveness in our prehistory that was a parallel to that. But when you made a decision, you got an immediate sense that it was the right decision. Mm-hmm. So in the book, as you might recall, there's a section that talks about a classic decision in human decision-making about, I'm walking through the woods, nighttime is coming, I need to get to shelter. I come upon a river and there's a fallen tree over the river. We're really well designed for that. You know how to push on the tree to see how secure it is. You know how to judge the strength. You know your own history of, can you swim? You have some sense of the temperature and how cold that water is and how cold the air is. You have some sense of how quickly the light is fading. All of this plays to your personal experience and your sensory capabilities. Think about climate change. We can't even perceive in our senses carbon dioxide. We did not need in evolutionary time to learn how to sense carbon dioxide in our senses. We can sense the color spectrum. We can sense certain toxins. Some are invisible to us, but some that were evolutionarily important, we can sense. We have tactile sensation. We can't perceive climate change except for its effects. And in addition, those effects are vague enough and have other potential causes that it's easy to discount them. Mm-hmm. In addition, the time frame is long beyond our individual experiential time frame. So it is a particularly tough problem for us to make rational or even, as I would say, emotional decisions about it. Mm-hmm. And it will come to us as information, which is newer evolutionarily, from people we don't necessarily know personally, from experience that we don't have viscerally, which is really just another way of saying in your brain, but we sense it as a visceral kind of a response. And it really plays to our weaknesses as decision makers.
Mm. So staying on that for a second though, Ann-Christine, the urgency. So we heard yesterday that the IPCC came up with a report saying that we might get to 1.5 degrees increase in temperature by the year 2035. One would expect this urgency or this sense of urgency to drive us to change our behavior. But in the book, you talk about that might not necessarily be the case. So why is it that even though we're told of this urgency, we still cannot change?
I wouldn't say we can't, but it's a challenge. And in part, it's a challenge because, as you know, it's easy to say we have to do it by this time, or we have to do it by that time. That time is in the future. We have trouble with that. We can intellectually feel it, but it's not the same as I'm hungry. I want to go get something to eat right now. Or, I need to go somewhere. I know how to get myself transported to that place. These decisions, these actions, these priorities are much easier for us than something that we perceive as theoretical and in the future. It's just hard for us to both perceive of that urgency in ways that are not just intellectual, which is a challenge for us. Sometimes urgency, it gets into our brains as fear of something that is imminent. But even fear is difficult. One of the ways that many people that have gotten involved in climate action get involved is because they have fear for their children. And that is a human reaction. But even there, it's something future and theoretic. Nonetheless, it can be a motivator. So fear can be a motivator, but the urgency of climate change as a concept is less compelling to most people than the urgency of some of its consequences, like a storm or a wildfire. As more of these events that are linked to climate change become apparent to people, more people are afraid, more people feel a sense of urgency, but it's still not the same kind of urgency as I got to get out of this building because it's on fire. We wish it were. Intellectually, we can make that leap, but it's still a challenge for the way we work.
Okay, so let's talk about one urgency we had as a globe not too long ago, which was the pandemic. That brought about immediate change. I mean, today, stay at home, work from home, all these societal changes. What made the COVID pandemic, the changes we've made, why were those easier to make compared to climate change?
That's a great question. And isn't it a little bit heartening that we were able to change like that? It shows that we can do it. Illness is something we know. Illness is something as old as people. And so the specter of an illness that can affect me or my loved ones, that is scarier than the specter of carbon dioxide elevation that I can't perceive. And I've never known anybody to die of carbon dioxide. I've known somebody to die of an illness that looks like COVID. And so it's just more in our experience, it's more in our culture. Nonetheless, we did have to make big pivots because the scale of a pandemic is so big. And so we did have to call upon our intellectual resources, our cooperative resources, which are not always easy to do. And we did have to think globally. Were we really good at it? Not necessarily, but people did, in fits and starts and with varying degrees, rise to the challenge. There were incredible technologic resources that went into creating the vaccines very quickly, disseminating them. Nonetheless, we weren't perfect at it. And one can level a lot of criticisms to how slow we were and how inequitable we were about our response. Nonetheless, we did make that pivot. I think in part it's because it was something we understood as an immediate threat.
We saw people dying and nobody wanted to die. And so that drove people to change. So in the book, intriguingly enough, for those who haven't read the book, if you want to understand that we're addicted to consumption, we're going to have a conversation about addiction and our addiction to consumption. You talk about behavioral change and how consumption of, especially say people in the high income countries, drives what is happening around climate. Talk about this acceleration of consumption and the addiction we have as a society to consuming things and the reward that we feel we get from consuming more stuff. Talk about that.
There have been people who have tried to make that conjunction between addiction as we think of it medically, addiction to substances, and then sometimes addiction to behaviors like gambling. Gambling is not a substance, but people believe, many people believe, some people question this, that you really can become addicted in the same way to a behavior, like gambling, and the other common example that's used is video addiction. Some people can actually become clinically addicted to shopping. And the link that I think is interesting.
Shopping.
Shopping.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And the link that some people make is that there are pathological conditions. This is one of the things that links it back to my field, where people actually can become addicted to certain behaviors like shopping under certain conditions of pathology. And to me, one of the intriguing links was the disease, Parkinson's disease, where it's not the disease that gets you addicted, it's the treatment of the disease. So in Parkinson's disease, there is a very specific decrease in a particular neurotransmitter that many people have heard of, dopamine, in a very particular, very localized spot in the brain. And in that particular spot where the disease affects the cells that create the dopamine, it manifests itself as changes in how people are able to control their movements. It's the motor system. But dopamine is a transmitter that goes throughout your brain and is heavily also involved in reward circuitry. And the treatment for Parkinson's disease, which is that local loss in a particular part that invests mostly into the motor system, increases the dopamine in other locations. So what was found is that the increase in dopamine in other locations can push people into these behavioral obsessions / addictions, things like consumption and shopping. This was the link that I found intriguing between what we might consider normal behavior and something driven by a pathology or a treatment of a pathology. So what was happening to these patients, and still happens to some patients, so we understand it better and can prevent it a little better, is that the increase in dopamine in one part of the system was having an overdose in other parts of the system. And what that helps link is to people who don't have Parkinson's, don't have extra dopamine given to them as a medical treatment, but get into these behavioral addictions to things like video gaming, shopping, and certain other conditions, which are basically excesses of consumption or excesses of the reward of consumption. Some people in the field have taken this as an evidence that our society as a whole, in the wealthy industrialized societies, have become quote unquote addicted. I'm going to use that word a little bit loosely here, to consumption. And when you think back to how our brains evolved, we get a reward. And again, I'm not talking about the kind of rewards you get because you use your credit card and you get points towards flying or something like that. I'm using the reward in the biologic sense by acquiring something that gives you a survival advantage or security. In modern humans, this translates to financial reward oftentimes. And it also can translate to material reward. And this addiction to shopping or gambling is another way of saying that we are getting a particular type of neural reward to consuming and acquiring certain things. Now, here's the problem. That kind of reward is very short-lived. Biologically, it is designed to be short-lived because the whole point of the dopaminergic reward system in our biology is that it teaches you what you need to survive. So if you're walking through a landscape and you're hungry and you're tired and you're thirsty and you come upon a patch of berries that you've never seen before, you've never been in this place before, your reward system is designed to say, oh, wow, those are the best berries I ever had. This is like wonderful. And in that neural mechanism, you will make associations between those berries, how you feel that, you get your hunger and thirst satisfied, and the other features of that landscape, so that next time you're in that circumstance, you now know where to look for berries. either come back to that place, or if you're a nomad, you look for similar features in the landscape. That's what you needed to learn to survive. But you also need to learn new things. So once you've learned those associations, you don't need to learn them anymore. Now you're gonna like the berries, but your reward system is designed to teach you the next thing you need to know to survive in the next adapted landscape that you encounter. The problem in modern life is that those rewards of consumption that are an outgrowth of the way the system was designed to work in the prehistory of humans, and it's not just humans, we were built on the landscape of animals that came before us and had this same system all the way back to invertebrates. It's very, very temporary. So in modern life, when you get a reward, you go shopping on Amazon, it's delivered to your door, it's great for a short time. The reward then goes away because that's how it's designed. It's designed to be transient. So I think in the book, I use the example of a furniture store. So, you get a new sofa. Well, now you want to complete the look. And they tell you that in the sales, people. Well, if you got a carpet that went with that sofa, it would be even better. And if you got an easy chair that went with that sofa, it would be even more rewarding. And each time you get a reward, but it goes away. So to keep the same satisfaction, you have to get more and more and more. And this plays to our biology in a way that increases our consumption.
It ties back then to climate and our consumption because we need those highs throughout our lives to feel that we're making it. And so change to affect our lifestyle that will take away those highs is they're difficult for us to do.
They are difficult, but the interesting thing is, and you may be planning to get to this, is that it doesn't make us happy. So those rewards were designed, that whole system was designed for short-term survival. But study after study has shown that long-term happiness is not based on these highs and lows of immediate reward. It's based on two main other things: a sense of purpose and relationships. And those two things are mediated quite differently in our neural circuitry. And that's what gives what we call happiness or long-term life satisfaction. So this chasing rewards doesn't get us where most of us think we want to go, which is to long-term life satisfaction.
But then, Ann-Christine, so let's talk about value then, right? Because part of this ties back to our value system, right? I mean, you're told you're going to school, get a job, make money, get rich, buy a big house, get a wife, multiple kids, multiple dogs, multiple cars. It's more, right? And that's how society values you. They say, oh, you're a great guy. Look at this guy. He got a multi-million-dollar house. He's great. He's successful. How do we change the value system? Because unless we change the value system, the reward is what's driving the value. So how do we bring about an understanding? I know it's not easy to change, but how do we change our value system so we stop looking at those things that are transient and start looking at things that are much more sustainable over the long run?
Well, I don't know that I can answer that. I mean, I'm just a neurosurgeon, but
not just. I mean, there's no neurosurgeon who's just.
But here's what a neuroscience approach helps us do. Here's the only value to this whole exploration in my mind, which is what neuroscience allows you to do is give an arm's length view to the way we are. We are the way we are for reasons that are understandable and comprehensible. And it allows us to say, are these societal values, which is what your question is about, do they make sense? Did they come from on high? Did they come from Harry Potter's magic wand? Or are these all an outgrowth of the way we work neurologically? And if it gives you that arm's length view, you don't have to be judgmental about it. You don't have to say this is bad and this is good. These people are bad to have these values. These people are good to have these values. You can say, where did this come from? And having that neuroscience view gives you the ability to say, we are not necessarily forced into this narrow idea of what's valuable. We can look at it objectively and say, there's a reason that we may feel this way, but we're not compelled to feel this way.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason that getting that house may feel rewarding. But you know what? For life satisfaction, I might be more rewarded if I have a smaller house and I volunteer and help people who have less than me, because we also know that the human reward system is not all about material reward. We are also rewarded by many other things. And each of us has our own traits where some things are more rewarding to us than others. Evolution designed us to be different from one another by design, because that way, as a group, as a society, we are better able to problem solve and adapt. But there are other rewards, including, as you and I have discussed, agency, the ability to make something happen. So the ability to solve a problem and come up with a good solution, the ability to connect to other people. Social rewards are extremely powerful for humans, both early in life and later in life. The reward of helping somebody. Now, you know, in your own life, as the people in the audience, there are people who are really driven by that altruistic reward. There are other people, that's not their thing. Their thing may be problem solving. Their thing may be something else. Thank heavens we're different from one another, because if we weren't, we would not have made the kinds of successes that we make. So we are not constrained to necessarily believe that what someone else tells us is rewarding, like the bigger house, is necessarily what is going to give us that long-term life satisfaction. Mm-hmm. And we can look at where it comes from and question it. We do have an extraordinary ability to question assumptions. And that's why you're an electrical engineer. You could question these things. That's why some of the people that I met today, your interns and your staff people, each of them has questioned certain things. We have that ability, and we can bring that to bear in crises like the climate crisis. We do not have to be constrained by a reward system that can only look at one reward.
Let's take a few more questions, and then we'll open up to the audience, see if we have any questions in the chat box as well. I want to talk about behavioral change. And in the book, you talk about some behaviors that matter most. And then you also talk about behaviors that are difficult to change and some that are much easier. Talk a little bit about the ones that are difficult to change and some that are easier to change.
When I went down this road of exploring the relationship between neuroscience and our climate crisis, the big question I had is, how flexible is our brain? How can we change? And I decided to look at some of those things in the health and public health world that were known to be difficult. And addiction and overeating are some of the ones that are linked and particularly difficult. And I wanted to know what has been shown. Lots of things have been tried. What has been shown to work the best? And then as a corollary to that question, I needed to know in my own mind, which are the behaviors that are contributing most to climate change? And most of the research has been done on individual behaviors, but we can scale this to the behaviors of people in other spheres of influence. So in the public health and health world, addiction is the classic example of something that's difficult to change. And what has been shown to work? Well, there's a few basic principles. Number one, positive is better than negative. In general, whether it's in education, addiction, or other spheres of difficult behavior change, people on average do better with positive interactions than negative. So praise versus punishment, for example. You do better making difficult behavior change happen by substituting a reward that is going to be active and substitute for the reward you're taking away. So the classic example are the 12-step programs in addiction, where you are substituting social reward, which is very powerful for humans, for the reward of the drug or the alcohol or whatever it is that you're giving up that you're addicted to. Sometimes it's a behavior, it's gambling, it's video games. Social rewards are incredibly powerful for human beings. So in 12-step programs, you have a community. You have people that are rooting for you. You have people who understand what you're going through. And this is why these things tend to work. So it's substituting one reward for another and It's getting you out of a context of habit where, again, these kinds of habitual connections are very powerful in humans and they're a big part of addiction. So it's getting you out of that context where the habit, book goes into more detail about this, is a neural circuit that is very challenging to break. It's why recidivism is high. But it's getting you out of that context so that you can create new habits and substitute for the old ones. In the world of climate change, there are behaviors that are the biggest contributor. And if anybody wants to know, you just type in carbon calculator and it will tell you in your own life, you fill in some blanks and it'll tell you in your own life where your carbon footprint is coming from. Mm-hmm. And for most people, it varies from person to person, but for most of us, the big ones are not the ones we think of. You know, you learn in school to recycle. Well, recycling is important, but it's a pretty small part of most people's carbon footprint. And the big ones tend to be how you get around, your transportation, how you heat and cool your house, what kind of food you eat, how much meat versus how much plant-based food. Agriculture is a big part of this. How many air flights you take, and how many children you have. So these are the things in people's individual lives where the carbon footprints for most of us are the biggest. Some people have said, why try to change behavior? Individual behavior is not the answer to climate change. And that's absolutely pretty true. I had to look this up because I didn't know, and I had to read a lot and get some sense in my own mind as to where this comes down. And about half the carbon problem from high industrial countries comes from individual choices we make, and about half comes from things we don't have much control over. That said, behavior change does not just apply to our individual personal choices. It also applies to our choices in the workplace. If you are the president of a college, if you're an educator, if you're the CEO of a company, if you're the middle manager in an industry, you have to make these choices that affect many people. And the same equation about climate change will factor in. And so these behavior change decisions can follow the same principles. Substitute positive for negative. So if you're an industry leader and you have to make a tough choice that will reduce your profit margin, but improve your carbon footprint or your environmental profile, it's going to be a tough choice on your own. You're used to being rewarded by your shareholders saying, great profit margin this quarter. Mm-hmm. How do you substitute for that? Well, you substitute potentially by having other industry leaders, other people in your strata who do this together, and you get the social reward. So it's substituting social reward for what you're used to making your decisions based on, mm-hmm. which is the old reward. And these, I'm not saying this is easy, but if you don't have that social network or substitute a new reward, maybe it's your kids saying, wow, you did that, that's my future. Maybe it's some other kind of reward. But you have to realize that the rewards that you're used to are not going to apply to this problem. It's too new a problem for us as a society. It's not something we have a long history with. In fact, it's a first of its kind problem. Mm-hmm. So the equations for decision-making need to be new equations, and recognizing that no one's going to make a new decision with no reward. You just have to find some new ones and recognize that agency, caring for others, social rewards, these are the ones that we can call on to substitute for the old rewards, mm-hmm. which are largely material.
And we were seeing this now in many places around the world. Workers are asking, employees are asking for a different value system. They want to work from home. They want flexibility. So flexibility is now a new value that most corporations are having to grapple with. One last question for you, Ben, and we'll take one or two questions from the audience. I want you to talk a little bit about at what point everything you've talked about here in terms of understanding the brain and the circuitry, how do we apply it in take an example, like start your day, take me through a day where I show up to work, I have to eat lunch and I skip lunch. I think you have an example of that in the book. Help the audience and those listening to go back today and apply what they're hearing from you in terms of, oh, Dr. Duhaime said I should pause before I eat one more cookie, or I should do this before I do that. Walk us through this activity in the brain. Just take an example of how the brain will work between now and the time we get home.
Well, if you have absorbed anything from today's talk, you may reflect on the fact that you're making decisions at multiple levels every step of the way. And what influences you will not be immediately available to you. Whether you take a right or a left, I'll give you an example. You're going to walk home from here and you're either going to go this way or that way, and you could go either way. You might go towards the sunny side because it's a little chilly out. You're not thinking of that. You just do it.
What gets you to go towards the sunny side? Is it the reward of being in the sun?
It's nice.
Okay, so that's the reward. The reward is the heat.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Or you might deflect down towards the basin where the cherry blossoms are, and you don't think about it necessarily consciously, but that's the way your steps take you. So it's not always at a level where you're saying, I'm going to do this, and every decision that you make is like that. It's going to have multiple layers. Now, whether anyone is influenced by this discussion or not, I don't know, but you may think to yourself, do I really need that thing? Do I really need it? I'm going to get a short-term reward. It's not going to pay off. But more importantly, and at a bigger scale, if you were a leader in any capacity where you make decisions that may affect many people, you may be able to consciously reflect and say, I need to change my priorities. I need to change my equation a little bit because there is this overwhelmingly urgent, even if it doesn't feel that way, important, life-altering, globe-oriented crisis that is difficult for me to perceive. My equations need to change for the future of all of us. And I can do that. I have the brain that can make that happen. I have that capacity to change the equation. It is not going to feel, that decision is not likely to feel rewarding in the same way that I have relied on to make all my decisions up to this point. I've relied on an entire human history and personal history of equations that have directed my decisions. This time and these decisions are different from anything in my history and anything in our collective history, and it is not going to feel the same. I am not going to feel the same certainty that this decision that is a pro-environmental decision is going to have the same visceral feel. And I have to make that tough decision anyway. Make it easier. I'm going to find like-minded people. I'm going to look at my children and my grandchildren. I'm going to get some cognitive input as to how this may have ramifications in the future. I can't rely on the same reactions that I have always relied on. And I'm aware of that, and I'm taking that into account, and I'm making that tough decision anyway.
Okay. Question in the audience.
So you're a neurosurgeon as well as an advocate. So I wanted to know how has your practice shaped your theory? So how have your experiences with patients affected how this book came about?
Thanks. I think part of it is that in a field like mine, in neurosurgery, particularly pediatric neurosurgery, where I take care of children, there is nothing more important that I've ever seen to a person than their child. That particular bond, that particular obsession and concern is the most potent force I've ever experienced. And for this reason, it's clear to me that there is something evolutionarily predisposed in the human condition because of the utter power of that bond and that concern. Parents would much rather they were the one with the brain tumor than their child had the brain tumor. They would put themselves in their child's position in a millisecond, the vast majority of them. This is so consistent. And I think that convinced me that our brains are the way they are for evolutionary reasons, and that they are extraordinarily potent. And I've also had the privilege of witnessing the grace and utter awesome humanity of people, even under circumstances of terrible, terrible tragedy. So I have faith in humans. I think I have faith in the human brain and in the way our brains were designed to work based on those intense, somewhat artificially intense, but because the circumstances are artificial, but I have utter conviction of the essential goodness and capacity of human beings to adapt, change, and to rely on these human interactions and the power of them. And so I think that's maybe the way I can answer that question. I think I have faith in the biology of the human brain and its capacity based on some of these experiences, and also on the plasticity and adaptability of the human brain as a function of the things I've seen in profession.
So let me ask a question on that. You in the book you talk about the Grain Children's Hospital. You spend a whole chapter is dedicated to that project. Can you just share with the audience, how that came about and what was the key takeaway from that project?
The Grain Children's Hospital project was a test case. And if one believes that the way to encourage pro-environmental behavior is to make it rewarding, could I, as an experiment, influence the leadership of my hospital to do something I thought was helpful for children and also pro-environmental by appealing to the things that they might find rewarding?
They meaning the administration.
The administration, the leadership, the finance people, and so forth. And what would be rewarding to them? The idea of a children's hospital is not that rewarding to them because they make their profit largely off the adult practices. Pediatric practices in a general hospital, just because of the way our healthcare system is, have a lower profit margin. So while people all want to have pediatric care for a variety of reasons to be a general hospital, it's not their biggest profit maker. So
I don't want to cut you off, Ann-Christine. I think it's ironic that the children are supposed to be the future of the world, but they should be more profitable, actually.
Yes, that's not the way the healthcare system works, unfortunately.
Okay.
Unless you are a freestanding children's hospital where you have, in some cities, a monopoly, and you can. It's about contracting. It's about the business side. We could give a whole talk on that. So I felt we needed a new children's hospital, and I wanted to make it a prototype because we're small enough to do this. We could make a hospital as a laboratory. So I had this whole vision. I had a whole lot of collaborators in the engineering school and in the business people and a variety of people, architecture people from around the world, really. And my idea was we were going to have this prototype. It's going to be 100-bed, roughly, children's hospital, first of its kind. It was going to be net zero energy or even positive. This is a challenge. This is an engineering challenge in a Northeast urban city like ours, Boston. And to make it rewarding to people who didn't even care about climate change. Remember, this was in 2014, 2015. Okay, it was a different political era at that time, and it may come back to that kind of political era. We will see. But at that time, there was a lot of climate denial still. And even in the healthcare field, it was like climate change is not our shift. This is somebody else's problem. So to appeal to people for whom climate change was not as urgent a problem as it was in my mind, the idea was this would be, besides being a prototype, first of its kind, it would be absolutely stunningly beautiful by appealing to our natural tendency to be attracted to nature. So this would be the absolutely most biophilic, most nature-filled facility ever invented. And it would be like walking into a forest as a hospital. And for kids and their families, I did a lot of work with people in related fields to see what the evidence was that this was actually helpful for healing and stress. And it clearly is. A natural environment has all sorts of health advantages. The indoor air quality would be better and so on. So for scientific reasons, for attractiveness reasons, and for being the first of its kind, which I thought would appeal to our leadership. We're at Harvard. We like being first. We like being the best. We like being the only. We like doing things first, right? And so I thought that I could appeal to our leadership on those grounds. It didn't fly because what I needed was a huge donor. And I'm not much of a fundraiser. And I didn't have contact with those kinds of people. And if I did, there were other priorities that they were led to. So it's still awaiting that finding of a big donor. Anybody out there? Let me know. But it did move the needle. So the lesson was, after that, and with input from other like-minded people, I'll tell you, social rewards are so important. We created a center for the environment and health at our hospital. That had not existed before. And that was a top-down and bottom-up kind of a thing. It was the clinicians worried about climate change and climate change's effect on health. And it was the leadership's recognition that we had to make an energy transition for financial reasons and for regulatory reasons. So they had an advantage at the top. They had an incentive. We had an incentive at the bottom. We met in the middle. We created this center, of which I'm now associate director. And we created a whole new journal, the Journal of Climate Change and Health. So many things tipped the needle, moved the needle. Our institution now is much more environmentally focused than it was. Part of it was this whole Green Children's Hospital push. So while we have not yet realized the vision of this hospital, which I still am utterly committed to and believe in and think would be amazing as a prototype, that would not in itself have a huge climate impact, but could be exported, and the technologies that we could develop with our incredible technological partnerships and expertise, energy and so on, could be transformative. Mm-hmm. I still believe in that vision. I'm still trying to realize that vision. So while I didn't get the administration to totally go there, they went part of the way. And that was a huge lesson of the flexibility, even of people with other priorities.
We got about 5 more minutes. I want to hopefully get through 3 questions. And I know this is a crunch time here, but one has to do with injustice in society and how that ties back to this conversation. A lot of discussions around environmental justice or just energy transition. We have the developed countries consuming more, the less developed countries. This comes to who should change, right? How do we talk about change and how to make change happen on a much more global scale as opposed to just the individual? How do we get those in the rich countries to change for the benefit of the entire planet, as opposed to saying even those in the poorer countries should also change? How does one do that?
Well, that's the trickiest problem, isn't it? And I don't even think we have to get global and international, although that's clearly the critical part. Even in our own neighborhoods, there is inequity that climate change affects the poorer, more marginalized, more underserved communities way before it affects others. How do you get people to behave collectively? It's a challenge for humans because they tend to make decisions based on immediacy and proximity and personal knowledge. So from a brain point of view, these are challenges. And again, I think the same principles apply. Like-minded people, movements, for example, the youth movements have affected people globally to realize this. And, you know, it goes without saying that the wealthier countries are going to have to consider that these problems are not local problems, these are global problems. We can't solve the problem without recognizing things that occur beyond our own perspective. And it's going to come back. The CO2 we put in the atmosphere doesn't It goes everywhere. And so I think that it's the same principles of why decisions that are not immediate are difficult for us, and why we have to think more long-term than short-term. We have to use our cognition. And I think we can appeal to some extent to selfish motives by recognizing that stuff doesn't stay where it is. This is a global problem, and we are in it together. Finally, there are rewards that we can tap into about helping people with less. There is a whole powerful reward to be gained from helping others. And if it's a choice between more for me or more for someone else, when I have enough, we have to start helping people feel the actual reward value of giving to others.
My second to the last question, I promise this is the second to the last, and I have one last question, but the second one before we get there is, this conversation is being watched and listened to by leaders. Some might be policymakers, some might be business leaders. What do they get out of this, reading this book, understanding the brain circuitry and understanding why it's important to look at the reward system? What would you want to tell a policymaker or a business leader watching this, why they should read this and apply some of the principles in this book?
I think that I want to get away from the idea that your brain is somehow hardwired. The brain's remarkably flexible. And if you know that, and you know where some of our decisions come from prehistorically, you will recognize your own capacity to change and your capacity to influence others to change. So I think the take-home message is one of hope and optimism and confidence. I think people get into a mindset that this is quote unquote human nature and we can't change. And I would challenge that. We can. I'm not saying it's easy, but there are certain things that are in the book that you can rely on to help you change yourself, change your priorities, change your attitudes, and help others to change as well.
Good. Now, my last question to Ann-Christine. So the last chapter in the book is called Sustainable Brain. And people watching this have kids. How do we work today as a society to get young people today to develop the sustainable brain or to develop that sustainable mindset that you talk about, so that when they get to a certain age, at least they have adapted some of the things you've talked about? How do we develop the brain of kids today, or at least help them to develop a more sustainable brain? Because I think for us, the time has passed. My brain can't be made sustainable anymore, right?
Yes, it can. Yes, it can. I would challenge that.
Okay.
First of all, I think you already have some sustainable.
Okay.
But second of all, change is not confined to youth. You continue to change up until you are no longer alive. And we forget that. It is true that people, there's adages about we get more conservative as we get older. There's some truth to that. We tend to like novelty more when we're young and familiarity more when we're older. But we continue to change throughout our lives, and we have that capacity. But to answer your question about children, I feel that in modern society, we have taken away some of children's agency. We schedule them, we teach them, we give them classes. We don't let them alone to figure it out on their own. That was part of evolutionary history. That's how you learned. You learned from playing with other kids in an unstructured environment. There's a movement in the educational world to try to restore activities that give children agency. They figure it out on their own. They figure out their own talents. So I would say that's part of it. And the other big part of it is, remember that rewards are varied. And it's not all about one kind of reward, which is financial or material reward, but encourage in children rewards of social rewards and agency and altruism and creativity, problem solving. And if we think of these things more broadly, we, I think, can encourage both sustainability and long-term life satisfaction as opposed to immediate material rewards and their short-lived timeframe.
Well, Ann-Christine, I have to say this has been a fascinating conversation. I have enjoyed reading the book. As I revealed to you this morning, that I actually went through it detailed. I think it's really going to impact our industry and the world as a whole, because I think this is one of the first books that have looked at understanding the brain and how it ties into climate change and some of the other challenges which we haven't got into today. You know, in vexing population, you have issues around poverty, a lot of other global challenges, but I think minding the climate is the first start, and I hope we can mind the other challenges and try to get to the bottom of this. So congratulations on the book. Please join me in thanking Dr. Ann-Christine Duhaime for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today's episode of Influential Minds. We will be sending out a Zoom recording to all attendees, and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel at a later date, where you can also find recordings from other past conversations and webinars. For more information and to continue engaging with EEI International Programs, please follow us on Twitter and visit our website. Check out the chat for links. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your day.